everybody, Fratum here, and the number one question I seem to get asked in the comments is, what distribution should I use? We cover a lot of distributions on this channel, and try to cover as many as possible just to get a good look at them, see what they're like to install, and see if they're worth, running. So I get a lot of new users on my channel who ask, as a new user to Linux, who has never used Linux before, what distribution should I use? Well, that made me think, if I was going to refer Linux to someone as a new user, what would I recommend? Well, I narrowed it down to 4 that I think are new user friendly, with one of them being borderline new user friendly. So we're going to cover those 4 distros just really quick. We're not going to do installs, just talk about them a little bit and the pros and cons in this episode, and kind of get a synopsis of where to go if you're new at Linux and what you might want to install and might want to try. Anyways, without further ado, let's move on and take a look. We'll start with number 4. Number 4, Antergos Linux. Antergos is more geared for the computer user who isn't afraid of cutting-edge software. Based on Arch Linux, it has a massive library of programs available, both through the Arch repository and the AUR repository. The AUR repository is a repository of programs compiled to run under Arch or Antergos by the Linux or the Arch community. You can install the desktop manager of your choice without much of a fuss. I do recommend Cinnamon or GNOME Desktop for the user who is new to the Linux world, mainly because these desktops are quite intuitive when coming from the Mac or Windows world. I prefer the GNOME Desktop, which you see here in this video demoing the Arch desktop. Arch has a reputation of being a very stable Linux system with cutting-edge software and frequent updates. So if you are comfortable with updating your system nearly daily, then this is the one for you. You can't go wrong with Antergos Linux. It is by far my favorite Linux, and I recommend it for the new user or even the advanced user. If you don't want to deal with installing Arch, Antergos is the way to go. Number 3, Solus Linux. Solus has a nice polished and stable desktop called Budgie Desktop, and those who are switching from Windows or Mac will feel right at home with this newcomer to the Linux distro world. Unlike a lot of distros, Solus is not based on a parent distribution. This has its pros and cons. The main pro is they do not have to wait for an upstream patch to fix security or stability issues. They can just patch and push the update as quickly as possible. But along those notes, since they are not relying on another distro to release packages, they may be a little slower on getting software to the end user, since they have to compile, install, and test all packages themselves. Overall, for an average user who is interested in doing office work, surfing the web, and watching videos, this distro will work just fine, and honestly, I feel in the future this distro will become one of the main distros available with a wide range of support for all types of applications. I wouldn't even be surprised if it became a parent distro and there were spin-offs from it, because it is that well done. I do gotta admit though, installing this distro was a little complicated. I had several crashes in the process. This could be virtual machine related, since I do tend to install my test environments on virtual machines. I've heard great things from people that have installed it on hardware, so I feel comfortable recommending this as number 3 on my list. Number 2, Ubuntu Linux. Ubuntu has made its name in the Linux world as one of the first distros that was easy to install. Ubuntu is probably the most supported distro out there, but tends to be behind by a few versions when it comes to applications. Although not cutting edge, the versions of software in the Ubuntu repository is typically the most stable versions, and you can install the applications without too much worry about things breaking. Ubuntu also tends to get better third-party support for new drivers and ported software. Companies such as Dell, System76, and Hewlett-Packard have supported Ubuntu from the factory. You will likely find it easier to find support for this distribution, and this is why I put it in the number 2 spot on my list. Not only is Ubuntu a great desktop distro with excellent office and browser support, it is also quite popular in the Linux gaming community,
and this is due to the huge amount of support from companies like Valve porting their Steam desktop client to the Linux. You'll find that most games on Steam that have Linux support will typically list Ubuntu as the supported distro. Just as a side note, there were issues a few years back about Ubuntu and privacy because they would send your searches to an Amazon app. But in recent releases, this is no longer true, at least not without opting in first. They do have the Amazon app installed to the desktop by default, and if you use it to make purchases, the Ubuntu folks will get a small commission from Amazon for the sale. Also, I want to mention that the default desktop for Ubuntu is Unity Desktop, and although you can install it on other distros, this is a desktop that was developed by the Ubuntu project. They do give back a lot to the Linux community, and that's one thing that makes the Ubuntu project awesome in my book. Number 1, Linux Mint. Linux Mint is an offshoot of Ubuntu, so a lot of it will seem familiar to you if you are coming from an Ubuntu install. Some of the nice features of Linux Mint is the Cinnamon desktop, along with the fact it comes with video and audio codecs that Ubuntu does not install without going through extra steps. In my experience, Linux Mint supports more hardware right from the get-go and tends to be a little bit more stable. Also, Linux Mint is a 100% free system where Ubuntu is somewhat commercial. Since it's based on Ubuntu, you have access to the same software packages most of the time. If not all of the time, any third-party software that claims support for Ubuntu will run just as well on Linux Mint. This is my go-to Linux whenever I help a new Linux user convert their system to Linux. Linux Mint gives you 2 choices for your desktop, Mate Desktop and Cinnamon. Mate is spelled M-A-T-E, and you might hear it pronounced as mate, but I do believe the correct pronunciation is Mate. I prefer the Cinnamon Desktop mainly because it feels more user-friendly. Cinnamon Desktop is developed for Linux Mint by the Linux Mint team, and it's nice and fast and feels comfortable when switching from a Windows environment. The Mate Desktop is a fork of GNOME 2 and is being developed by a different team. I do believe that it is something that is being developed for Linux Mint, but I haven't been able to prove that. Over the years, Mint has been my favorite Ubuntu-based distro, and just recently being switched out by Antergos. If I were to go back to an Ubuntu-based system, it would definitely be Mint with the Cinnamon desktop. Overall, there are a lot of distributions out there. Some are really easy to install and run. Some can be quite difficult. I made this list in response to several viewers asking me which Linux distro I would recommend for a beginner. I feel quite confident that a new user to Linux World would feel comfortable installing and running either one of these distros as a daily driver. Antergos might be more for the advanced user but still wants to get into Linux, but it feels comfortable with a little bit of tweaking. My criteria is based on ease of use, support, and popularity. A couple things that you might want to keep into consideration is that there's 2 types of update paths for Linux. One is the staged released Linux. That means that every so often, once or twice a year, they release a whole new version number, and the last version is supported for 2 to 3 years. So you have a 2 to 3 year life for the version that you're installing. That's a staged release. And then every few years you do a reinstall. Some of them can update in place, but it can be a pretty hairy thing. And that's the Ubuntu-based one. So Linux Mint and Ubuntu both are a staged released distribution. So that's something to consider. If you want to install your system and just not have to worry about it being end-of-lifed and unsupported anymore after 3 years, then you may not want to go with that. The other type of upgrading path is what they call a rolling release. That means that the Linux distribution will upgrade everything as we go. There's one installer and it just updates everything. You could have installed your system 5 years ago and it's still the most current version of that distribution. Antergos is a rolling release based on the Arch system. And I believe Solus Linux is also a rolling release. From what I've been reading on their site, it appears to be that it updates over time and you'll always have the latest version of the OS no matter what. And it's seamless. It just works and it's not a problem. That's one of the reasons I like Antergos and why I run it myself. So those are two things you might want to consider when looking at my list of 4. So based on all that information, I feel quite confident that if you go with one of the 4 that I picked, you'll be happy with it, and you'll learn Linux, and you'll have a lot of fun, and you'll have minimal trouble, and you'll see that Linux is a great operating system to replace Windows and Mac. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please give it a thumbs up and share and subscribe if you haven't yet. I hope you have a wonderful night, and thanks for watching. Take care. Bye-bye.